Henschker, and I'm running the Segal Center. It's a nice sunny day here in Manhattan today, and we are still in the middle of a reality that seems so much stranger than fiction. The corona numbers are up. Tumult in the White House with rejecting of election results and meetings this morning in the White House that so many of us think are unconstitutional and a real jeopardy to democracy. But in this turbulent time, we do need to talk about also what we think is essential, what's important, even though society tells us theater is not essential. We believe it is, art is important, it's significant, and the voices of the artists are what we perhaps have to listen to even closer now than ever. We at the Segal Center always thought that next to the directors or the playwrights, also the voices of the dramaturgs, the producers, the curators are of equal importance. It's a collective work in theater. We are understanding that more and more like a sports team. There might be the ones who do the goals and or keep the penalty kicks, but it's a team effort. And in this idea of the expanded understanding of theater, of dramaturgy, we have with us here a great thinker and also worker in the field, in the vineyards of theater, as my colleague, Professor Peter Eckersall, one of the leading thinkers in theater and also a great teacher. Here at the Segal Talk since March, we talk to theater artists and to capture the moment, archive the moment of this time of Corona. What is changing, what perhaps already has changed. And after a little break in September, we went back to think about themes like Theater of the Real, which we had a series with Carol Martin, where we will have a second week. And now this week we focused on dramaturgy. We had the inspiring Sebastian Kaiser from the Volksbühne Berlin, who talked about us what it meant to have that great theater after the opening of the wall, the work of Frank Castor, what it meant to the city, how much it was part of a reinvention of a city, that it focused energy and attention, and also understood that next to plays, that also part of a transformation are activities, discussions, thought, people occupying a theater with their feet around the clock, and how much that has changed and also represented something new after also an event that is as significant as the shutdown here. It was the opening of the wall. In a way, we see ourselves in the work of the great Svetlana Alexievich, who created this great body of work of interviews. She said, perhaps it's not a moment also to create fiction or a theory. She recorded testimonies of witnesses and participants in the history, and in great work at the end of the Red Yeoman, the Red Man, the Red Person, and the Holocaust diaries. And the same, I think, we are doing here. We really are creating an archive, a monument to the courage, but also the suffering and the thoughts the field is going through. Yesterday we had Anne Cattaneo and Sidney Mahone, who were talking about the time in the 80s when dramaturgy took hold for the first time in the Americas, when it became a significant part of it. It's still not as much in the center as it is in Europe, but it is was the beginning of the change. And Anne, who was still at the Lincoln Center Theater, and Sydney, who was with the Horizon Theater in New Brunswick, who really made a tremendous pioneering contribution. The founders, she were co-founders of Lambda, the Association of Dramaturgs. I'm sure some are listening today. And so today in that journey, in this multifaceted journey of dramaturgy, we are now coming to Peter Eckersall, who represents international, European, Asian way of thinking. Let me tell you a few words about him. He is a teacher, or professor, we say, but he is a teacher of the PhD program in theater and performance at the Graduate Center CUNY, the City University of New York, where this dramaturgy also is in the center of his teachings. And he's a fellow at the University of Melbourne. His publications include Machine-Made Silence with Kristof van Baarle in 2020, just this year, the Routledge Companion to Theater and Politics with Helena Grehan, New Media Dramaturgy, which he co-authored with Helena Grehan again at Scheer, and Performativity and Events, in the 60s. Japan also work. He's most known for his an Asian theater specialist, Japanese theater specialist, and very deep insights into dramaturgy. And he has worked a lot. He was also running a company, a co-founder of a respected, highly respected Australian company. The name was Not Yet. It's difficult. And so he was a practitioner for, I think, almost a decade. And also he worked as a dramaturg for pieces that appeared in LaMama and in the Riga Biennial pieces. So Peter, welcome. And I hope you forgive me my long introduction. We always say it's about listening, and then I go on, but I think it is important to have some context. Where are you at the moment?
Thanks, Frank. Well, I'm in New York in my apartment, where I've been since March. Pretty much just, being located in a very tiny part of the city and navigating that part of the city every day in my walks and in my work. So, it's a kind of thing, a dramaturgy of smallness, I guess you could say. Mm-hmm. So, but as you said, it's a nice day here. So it's a very nice time of the year in New York.
Yeah, you like Marvin Carlson, you two are people who normally travel around, go around, see things. How does it feel to be in a small enclosed space?
Well, in some ways, I guess it's a relief not to be traveling so much, and because we're always aware of the impact on the environment of that, but also on our time and on our work, because we have to keep up our teaching and our research. And so, in some ways, once one stops, one sort of sees a different sense of space and time, which I think is good to experience again. But I must say also, it's been challenging to run a program and work with people in classrooms and on their projects at this time, because it's not just my work that stopped, it's a lot of theatre work that stopped, and it's a lot of the research that students are doing in their PhDs that stopped. And so we're I think after a long time now, we're pretty much in a moment of waiting for, it's a perverse time, because we have probably some of the highest rates of infection in the country now, of any time during the pandemic, and yet at the same time it feels like people are waiting for the vaccines to arrive and for some sense of there being a time after the end of the pandemic. So time stretched, I guess, in that way. So it's interesting time to contemplate that kind of thinking, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's quite something, and we all deal differently with it. We read, we listen. People dance in their apartments every evening. Some people write. Anio, who was here yesterday, she's working on a Kleist book. You decided to use this time, next to your ongoing project, to focus on dramaturgy. Tell us why, and what is the book about?
Well, essentially we have a long summer break where normally we would be going to conferences or doing, I do a lot of international research projects and artistic projects, and they were all put on hold. And for a long time now, I've been wanting to work on a book on dramaturgy that I think, I was thinking a lot about the way in which contemporary performance had really changed its relationship to text, that was dealing with new political issues and new trends within society and culture, and thinking about the way in which performance itself had adapted and responded to, not so much representing these kind of activities in a didactic or Brechtian sense, but as you said in your introduction, a moment where these things are being recorded and documented. So there is an extension here from the topic of last week, and the kind of so-called theatre of the real, or documentary theatre, in that I was thinking a lot about that trend in performance after post-traumatic theatre, where playwrights are sometimes dealing with a sense of crisis in the form. They're no longer trusting the words that they use. They're no longer trusting the impact of poetry, or of no longer trusting the the idea of a kind of classical notion of representation, and moving into a more interdisciplinary and hybrid performance framework that often includes moments of the play form transforming into something else. So something that might include some kind of visual arts references. So moving from theatre into performance with an installation component, or mixing the performance of a drama with some of our understanding of how dance is contributed to the work. And then parallel to this is the great rise of interest in performance in visual arts context. So I was thinking about how do we try and theorize that and try and account for that in a book form. And I began with the idea of the theatre of image in some respects, the way in which playwrights were typically, and now here I'm talking about, you know, a certain trend in theatre. I'm not necessarily talking about that continuing project of mainstream theatre where essentially theatre hasn't changed for a long time. And I'm not particularly concerned about that. I'm not really concerned in the book about whether that kind of theatre should change or not. That's not my argument. My argument is about the way in which this contemporary performance world is developing new vocabularies of performance that are taking us to a different understanding of what performance is and what it does and how it communicates its meanings to audiences. So a couple of years ago, I wrote a short text for the 100th issue of the journal Performance Research, where I was asked to write a short text on dramaturgy. That was a project that the editor of Performance Research, Richard Goff, commissioned 99 essays, each on a single word or key word of each of the 99 previous themes of those issues of the journal. So anybody who knows performance research knows that it has, it's a theme-based journal that has a key word, usually after the word on, so on politics or on climate or on dramaturgy. And I was given the task to write an essay on dramaturgy, and I started to think about the way in which, you know, after Bertolt Brecht, dramaturgy was really a practice of making things visible, was making things in the political world, in the social world, in the cultural world, visible in a way that was opening it up to some kind of inquiry from an audience. And then mapping onto that, my interest in visuality and media and non-text-based performance. So this concept of making visible is both I guess an older, more established understanding of what dramaturgy does in the theatre. That is, you know, an understanding of a Brechtian dramaturgy with a more contemporary setting for dramaturgy, which is thinking about the challenge of thinking about the dramaturgy of sound or vision or music or presence or smoke or atmosphere, very much a so-called new dramaturgy approach. And so I wrote that as a short text, and then when I was over the summer this year, I was thinking that I should use this time productively and try and put down these thoughts for a book. And so I wrote a book proposal, and I came back to the essay, The Dramaturgy to Make Visible, and put it together with my interest in the presentation of themes, political themes, cultural themes in contemporary theatre. And so the book is Proposals, Dramaturgy to Make Visible, Remaking Politics in Contemporary Performance. Mm-hmm. So, and it's, you know, I'm started writing this book now, and I'm hoping to write the book over the next 12 months. So really making a very concerted effort to start a writing practice that I'll try and do every day at the beginning of the day before I do my other work. So yeah, I guess one of the interesting things for me is that this is a way in which I can reflect on some of the disparate parts of my work, both as a dramaturg and as an academic. I've worked in both fields for a very long time now. And as you mentioned, I come from Australia. I was a performance maker in Australia with NYID and with other companies, and working as a dramaturg with artists as a freelance dramaturg, always in a field of what I would call performance dramaturgy rather than working with playwrights. That's an expertise that people like Anne your speaker yesterday have, or other text-based dramaturgs, I guess. But I grew up in the performance dramaturgy tradition, and I wanted to write about that, not only in terms of my connections to Australian work, but also, a lot of our work has been in Asia. Again, combining my academic expertise on Japanese theatre. I did a PhD in the Department of Japanese Studies, wrote about the 60s in Japan and its relationship to theatre, and have worked on contemporary performance as a researcher ever since, and done a lot of projects in the region too. So I was wanting to bring that kind of understanding of dramaturgy that is perhaps not as centrally focused on the US or the UK or the European contexts, and thinking about how dramaturgy is working in the world, across the world, in different locations.
Yeah. I feel it's about the dramaturgy of dramaturgy.
Yeah.
You are right, and your research is about the construction of work, the presentation of work, the reception of work, and you have that term of the transformation in the 60s. So maybe tell us a bit about that idea.
Well, to me, the important thing about dramaturgy, and the reason why I think it is, why I work in that field, and why I think it's important to theatre, is that it really makes us focus on the question of what happens when we translate an idea into practice. So there's a transformation from a kind of theoretical, cultural, political world into some kind of artistic representation, artistic production, or maybe even some presentation. And so how do we take ideas that are, hugely important, ideas that address really some of the enduring and important problems of our time, that are usually discussed in other fields, in science or in the humanities, and yet, we now have an understanding that artistic practice is also an important way of addressing these ideas. And dramaturgy, for me, is a way of thinking about that transformational process from the kind of research that one does, from the kind of political perspectives or cultural perspectives and voices that we want to, the things that we want to say in and through our artistic practice. But dramaturgy charts the process of getting from A to B, in a sense, from the idea, its conception, into some embodied, spatialized, dramaturgical representation or presentation on the stage, or in some public forum. And the crucial thing is that dramaturgy, for me, and this reflects my training in the contemporary performance world of dramaturgy, it makes that conversation visible. So it doesn't hide the kind of explicit use of techniques or strategies or artistic creations to present those ideas. It makes them visible as a part of the creative process. So when we then go and watch a work, we engage in a conversation about our response to the work and our feelings about the work, but also we can see the construction of the work in a certain kind of way. We can see the artist's thinking in the way that the work is signaling to that thinking through the visibility of the form, through the visibility of the conversation about the form. So naturalistic theatre typically historically hides its form and naturalizes it and pretends that the form is, that we're simply just watching something that is happening in the world. Whereas I think this other end of the spectrum makes the form itself very visible and part of the conversation of the work itself. That is inherently dramaturgical. So that's very much where I'm coming from in relation to thinking about that question of transformation. And if we go back to the 60s, I think we're talking about a historical era that thought about these kinds of forms differently to the way we think about them now. It's an interesting exercise to think about going into the time machine and going back and perhaps seeing some of these iconic performances from the 1960s that we have some record of through video or film or photography or people's diaries and so on. But they were very much premised on a different understanding of transformation. They were very much premised on a different understanding of the politics of dramaturgy. And in many cases around the world, we had this moment of eruption of a thinking about the politics of experience, of a thinking about sensation as being political, as a connecting almost symbolically of the kind of presence of bodies on the street in these kind of evolving protest movements that were really a kind of moment in the 60s, and the kind of highly explicit presentation of bodies in the theatre. And there's points of commonality between what was going on in Japan and, say, New York at that time, but there's also quite specific differences. And you could say that largely, I think it's a theatre of bodies in the 60s that is being kind of explored here. And by that, I mean it's the body as an expressive political medium, not just as a kind of aesthetic medium. It's a very contrasting time to now, I think, because the way that performance has evolved since that time and the way that politics have evolved since that time have meant that we now relate to the body differently. We relate to the text differently. We relate to the understanding of what a radical politics might be differently, because the times demand something new, as you so rightly say.
Yeah. You quote Marianne Van Kerkoven as one of your main witnesses, perhaps next to Brecht. She's not so well known. Why is she central? What did she tell us?
Well, so when I started work as a dramaturg, essentially I started work as a dramaturg without really knowing what a dramaturg was. There was no training of dramaturgs. This is when we founded our company, Not Yet It's Difficult. And we knew that we wanted to do something that was research-based and that was not play-based as a form, but something that drew on plays as one of the texts in the kind of production of a new kind of work. We knew that we wanted to work with some of our training that we'd experienced as a company through our connections to colleagues in Asia. So this was a political move for us. We were, we were of a generation who decided that we didn't need to go to London or New York to learn how to be theatre artists. Instead, we were very much committed to the idea of working in a region, and also, as in reference to our own culture that was dramatically transforming in relation to questions of immigration and diversity. So Australia is to a large, not to a whole degree, I mean, it has a British heritage and Indigenous heritage, but it's also quite mobile in its Asianness, I would say. But we didn't really know what a dramaturg was, so we kind of made it up as we went along. But then I was introduced to Marianne Van Kerkoven, who is a dramaturg or was a dramaturg, one of the great dramaturgs of the French or the Flemish New Wave. And Marianne was a pioneering figure in European new dramaturgy. She is the person who coined the term new dramaturgy. And a part of that was her relationship back to the 60s. She was, as she always said, 68 generation. She was part of a group of artists in Europe, and also a part of philosophers and scholars who experienced, I guess, the possibilities of the 60s, and then also the collapse of those possibilities. So when people refer to 68, they're always referring to a kind of moment of crisis, a moment when, you know, what was a possible way forward for a political movement was no longer possible. So that, I think, haunted that generation of not just theatre artists, but also philosophers. And we can think of Deleuze and Guattari as 68 generation. We can think of many people from artistic fields and philosophical and political fields as trying to think through, in a way, what was the possibility for politics now after 68. And by 68, we're talking broadly a latitude of years from 68 to 72 maybe. And it includes signature events such as the end of the Paris 68 revolution, the rise of ultra-leftist political organizations like the Red Brigade and the Baader Meinhof and their eventual collapse, the ridiculous, pretentious suicide of Mishima, you know, where he, you know, from the right wing tried to lead a military coup in Japan. All of these kind of events, and of course the end of the Vietnam War, and the sense that what was promised was not quite realized. So Marianne, taking that thinking into her theatre practice, also became a dramaturg. And she was one of the founders of the Kai Theatre in Brussels, which was founded in the 1980s as a theatre where there were a lot of interdisciplinary practitioners. So what went on to become the very famous Belgian New or Flemish New Wave began in those times with a group of artists that included people like Jan Fabre, Marianne, and Theresa de Kiersmaker, and a little bit after that, company Segal and so on and so on. So you have this conversation between theatre and dance, this theatre and visual arts, this conversation between theatre and philosophy and theatre and politics. And so Marianne's idea was that this, you know, this is a new kind of theatre, it needs a new kind of dramaturgy. And so in a series of texts that she published in the 1980s, she started to theorize this idea of a new kind of dramaturgy. And on the one hand, she always said it was a dramaturgy that was about learning to handle complexity. And that was a complexity of aesthetic conditions, but it was also a complexity of politics for her. So, you know, things were no longer to be seen in diametrically opposed terms or in terms that were simply black and white, but there was a complexity and a kind of movement of politics that was in motion and in flow. And the theatre, the performance world needed to engage with that idea much more than it had done in the past. She also proposed a dramaturgy of you know, she wrote a text where she said, you know, is there a dramaturgy? What is the dramaturgy of light? What is the dramaturgy of space and design? What is the dramaturgy of an actor? So she gave us a proposition for dramaturgy that was no longer simply concerned with story arcs or constructions of the play script or a kind of narrative practice or a storytelling practice, if you want to call it that. It was concerned about form, and about the way in which form itself was also structural. And it became a medium through which you could create a new kind of performance, a medium that you could have these conversations between forms, and you could start to explore the experiences of life differently and present those experiences to audiences in different ways, and therefore give rise to new conversations about society, culture, politics, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that perhaps this is one of the changes, that instead of simplifying the world that we understand it in the Brechttian fable, for example, that the ambiguity, that the complexity actually is what it is all about, to reflect how life, what's real, how life really is,
Yeah.
what meaning really
Yeah.
represents.
Well, I think this is crucial, and I think it's it's her major political contribution in a way, or artistic contribution as well. But in a world that is being surrounded in the by the turn of the 21st century, where politics have become banal in a certain kind of sense, where media and especially the rise of right-wing politics, but also left-wing politics, have become much more hardened in their perspectives on what is good and bad, what is acceptable and not, and where you have the rise of a kind of a new form of authoritarianism that we're living through in our time. The response always has to be complexity. The response always has to be, things are never that simple. Let's think through the complexities of this and allow for the complexities of this. Let's develop artistic and models, but also thinking models, ways of thinking that enable us to think about the complexity of things and to think in a way that is much more inclusive as a result. And then when you come at the other end of that, you start to see a new role for theatre, because if theatre is to embrace complexity, well, then it has to be something that engages in different forms, multi-forms. It has to do different things. Theatres themselves are no longer just sites for the presentation of the latest season or the latest new play by a star playwright, or the presentation of the new performance with the star actor. They are places for the debate and exchange of ideas. And so you have, people turning theatres into universities, or theatre suddenly starts to operate in a much more rich and diverse and complex terrain. And so I think that complexity should never be seen as a criticism. It should be seen as a virtue.
Mm-hmm. What are places or what are artists you think they represent that idea?
Well, we do use the shorthand contemporary performance to describe this kind of work, and that's, I mean, in a way, it's not helpful, because contemporary performance is such a vague term that it could be possibly anything. But it is a term that I think has meaning to artists in different places around the world, who are drawn to. Again, we come back to the question of what dramaturgy is, who are drawn to dramaturgical strategies that make visible their understanding of theatre as a site of information, knowledge, activism, rupture, and perhaps, to use Chantal Mouffe's term, agonism. So theatre that is resisting. In that way, we can come back to Sebastian Kaiser's conversation. For him, I think, I don't mean to speak on behalf of him, but, that theatre, that Volksbühne, and his work is always on the side of resisting. It's always on the side of critical response. It's always on the side of looking at things in a more complex way. So you can think of artists who are doing that across the globe, who I think are now, we could say that playwrights are also doing this, and my argument is never with playwrights. It's just that I'm talking about contemporary performance. There are, really remarkable plays that address complex themes and ideas and issues and teach us something about the state of the world. But I think what defines these practices is their openness to interdisciplinarity. They're very often collaborative works. They're produced out of a sense of artistic collaboration. They're very often produced out of a different relationship to audience. And they're very often produced with a dramaturg in the room. Who has perhaps a more active role, not just as a person who's a kind of show doctor, but somebody who is present to curate a series of engagements with the themes and issues so that that can have influence on the work.
Mm-hmm. You talk about artists like Toshiki Okada, Christopher Donk in Belgium, Ostermeyer on the Schaubuhne, when it turns around. What do they stand for in their work?
Well, I mean, this is very much what I'm going to write about in the book. It's obviously something that I'm interpreting. These are all great artists who I think their work speaks to what they stand for, and they all they're all very good at talking about their work too, and making statements about that. But so my response is an engagement with what they're doing or what I think they're doing. Okada, for example, I think is really interesting because a contemporary Japanese playwright and director who began working as a young artist in the late 1990s, but really grew up in the 21st century and has written 2 or 3, I think, of, well, I'm biased because I'm a Japanese theatre specialist, but 2 or 3 of the most important plays of the 21st century, shall we say. Now, his work is phenomenally interesting because, first of all, one of his primary orientations is Brecht. He's acknowledged that, when he was a young man, he came across the writings on Brecht. He was actually studying business or economy at university, and he initially thought he might be a filmmaker, but then he ended up in theatre. After reading Brecht's work and also reading text by Hirata Oizawa, the very well-known playwright and director who is famous for inventing the Gendai Kogo Engeki, or the colloquial theatre of Japan. The critics have dubbed this quiet theatre. Now, people are probably familiar with Hirata's work because it's been produced in international forums very often. Most recently, his work has been the famous robot plays, where he's produced plays with humans and non-humans on the stage and robots, performing in a very realistic kind of theatre, quote unquote. Okada is the next generation on, somebody who has an interest in everyday life and the experience of everyday people. But his early work was very much about the subcultural people living in Japan after the end of the bubble economy. So living in a time of precarity, living in a time when, living in a kind of malaise of the 21st century, which, and here we, I think we have to be very careful about distinguishing the differences of people's lives around the globe. But many people in so advanced postmodern economies or neoliberal economies experience a certain kind of comfort in the discomfort of it. There's a sense that they can't move forward, they can't move back, but they're not in, this is precarity rather than extreme deprivation. And there's something about that experience that is it's actually an experience of alienation, but an experience that is of alienation that is very different to the way we would have thought about it in Marxist terms or in Brechtian terms, where the alienation was always in relation to something else. I'm alienated from my work, I'm alienated from my parents, I'm alienated from whatever. Mm-hmm. Okada's work really sees us all alienated in all the time, but the object of what we're alienated from is not so clear. We're simply in a world that is kind of stuck. We're in a world that is a certain kind of quiet authoritarian politics. And I think he depicts these states very well. His signature and remarkable groundbreaking play was a work called 5 Days in March, written in 2003, in which 2 young hipsters from Shibuya, speaking very subcultural Japanese language, very hard to understand unless you were part of that milieu, go to a love hotel, a pay-by-the-hour hotel. It's a kind of East Asian thing where there's little privacy in those cultures. So young people often go to a hotel that is specifically for having sex, and they spend 5 days in the love hotel in a kind of sex marathon, and it's the same 5 days as the outbreak of the Gulf War. And so the play draws us into a kind of set of circles, concentric circles about disaffected youth, about this kind of ambient durational sexuality that is ultimately lacking any kind of emotional intensity. It's certainly, the play is obsessed with naming locations and places, so it's dealing with the kind of transformation of the urban world of Shibuya. It's cool. It's got a cool factor in that these are hipster young people, and then it's referencing the fact that we have this concentric circle of the post-war situation of Japan, where because of the American authored post-war constitution, Japan has foregone the right to declare war, and yet has to be in this war, in this coalition of the willing, way back in, this is the Bush era. But they're there in the Middle East, but they're not allowed to shoot anybody. So the play puts together these kind of concentric circles of the personal and the national and the global, and really gives us a sense of this being not just a particular condition, but a kind of endless moment of and he's a playwright and director, and so there's a very pioneering use of the physicality of the actors in his technique of staging this play and his many other plays, that is disrupting the text and changing our understanding of what it means to hear a story, and the story becomes very fragmented, and we have a kind of contrast between the level of the story that's being narrated and the physicality of the bodies, and creating these very ambient qualities of disturbance. And so moving forward, that question of creating ambient qualities of disturbance I find really fascinating. Mm-hmm. Because it's not like, when we go into the streets, and I mean, if in some places you do, if you're living in Hong Kong or in Brazil or in the Philippines, the visibility of authoritarianism is there,
Yeah, and but, also the repetition of history, the Oshima references, to the famous film. And I think, you also talk about it, and I think also what about the idea of the atmosphere, right?
So I'm fascinated with this idea of the presence of atmosphere in performance, and it's become almost a way of communicating something that is beyond communication. So if we're talking about cataclysmic events, they're very often beyond representation. There's this question of how do we represent something as traumatic as the Fukushima disaster, or but we're not just talking about the magnitude of large events, but also small events. What do we gain from simply just sort of translating them into a kind of narrative-based story of that event? The question is, well, perhaps not much. We have to create these, because very often the intensity of these events is communicated not through the kind of narrative structures, but through the feelingness of them, through the ways in which we are aware of things that are slightly beyond our comprehension or apprehension, shall we say. And yet they are the kind of dark forces that are coming into our world. The atmosphere of authoritarianism in politics, the darkness of that kind of experience, and what it feels like to be living in a society that is in that stage of existence. Alternatively, the atmosphere of a kind of, endless kind of consumption of, the sensationalism and emptiness of that. These are things that we can write about or, and speak about, but in order to convey the sensibility of that, how it feels in the body. Well, then I think we're seeing artists use these techniques of atmospheric production much more than in the past. I'm thinking of the way in which Okada's work transforms literally out of a play frame into some kind of other experience of it's a performance, but it's the texture and the structure of the play is broken down, and it's transformed into something that we feel and we respond to with a series of questions about that. In New York, Richard Maxwell has done several works that have been extremely uncanny in the way that they resolve or don't resolve. And I think that that's another really good example of the kind of thing that I'm talking about. Chris Verdonk, you mentioned. Well, Chris is he's never worked in realist theatre. He's a performance maker with a strong connection to visual arts practice, and he has many uncanny objects on his stage, performing in a way that is communicating a real sense of crisis about the existence of the planet. His work is very strongly connected to themes of the end, this kind of moment of necro-capitalism, where capitalism is eating the very sustainability of the planet. It's eating itself, and it's going to take us with it. And I think Chris's work is trying to explain or give us a sense of the of the fact that is what's happening. And so, if you want to talk about the unrepresentability of something, well, then you talk about this kind of excessive necro-capitalist event that is taking place in our world now. Mm-hmm. You can't encapsulate it in a single play, but you can express some sensibilities of loss and of transformation and of passing and of apocalypse.
You worked with him also as a dramaturg. So how is his approach to these kind of doom or this apocalyptic thinking? He works on Kafka or other. How does he do it as a theater performer? How does he approach a work?
I work with Chris as a scholar of his work. I'm not formally his dramaturg. That honor goes to originally Marianne Van Kerkoven, but now Kristof van Baarle, a younger dramaturg working in Brussels, in Belgium. But I do have a lot of connection to that practice, and so I do have an understanding. Ironically, Chris always begins with a close reading of the text, and the text is the departure point for performances, which very often, when you see the performances, there's no text left, but there is a process of taking the kind of sensibility of that text into the ultimate outcome or production. So, as you said, Chris's work is very concerned with a concentration of authors around the mid-20th century, Kafka, Beckett, Daniel Hymes, the Russian surrealist poet, but also another point of reference for Chris is always J.G. Ballard, the science fiction writer. And I mean, what defines these texts, I think, in many respects, is this sense of identifying the crisis of living, the difficulty of living, the forces that are aligned against one living, but also the sense of just living in that moment, in a kind of classic Beckettian sense. Nobody dies, nobody does anything. They just live in this kind of endless present of the horror of living. And so typically Chris begins with a text. Recently, he's also been very concerned with null plays, and that's where I have done a lot more work with Chris, because a null play is by definition a ghost play.
A Japanese null play, yeah.
Yeah, a Japanese null play. So a null play is always a play in which ghosts appear on the stage to tell about something that has happened that has led to their death. And so it's a beautiful form to think about in relation to staging the kind of crisis of apocalypse in relation to climate change. Because we can talk about it as if it's already happened. And this close reading of a text is it's very dramaturgical, and it's the kind of dramaturgical work that one might do when one is working with a playwright, ironically. You look at the combination of the words and the structure of the words and the way that they resonate with other themes and the way that they give life to certain kinds of imagination. And it's what they give life to that then Chris takes into typically, although not always, a non-verbal presentation. And so, Chris's work is pretty much maybe in three broad areas. There's the works that are object-based installation arts that happen in gallery spaces. There's the works that have a strong emphasis on the materiality of the stage and the performance of objects and machines, and then he's done throughout his career, but more recently, a number of works that are in fact theatre. Most recently he's done a work that very much is working with the text of Beckett, and the very famous European actor Johan Leysen, in a solo performance, is working with that text as an actor, and that's an ongoing project where the actor is immersed in a space of things, and so it's a way of exploring the kind of the darkness of Beckett, but also the humor of Beckett. But the actor is in an environment where there is also other transformations taking place, and so we're again watching this complexity, I think, of things unfold. His Something Out of Nothing, by contrast, was a piece that featured uncanny objects that would descend from the heavens and almost like mutant triffid flowers would proliferate and open, and very, very beautiful, but also very dystopian. And meanwhile, there was a collection of dancers in perhaps non-human form with very strange costumes and head dresses that made them look somewhat plant-like or some like animal. There's a vast range of interpretations of this. And then a celloist who provides the live soundtrack, which increasingly invades the sensorium of the audience to the point of a kind of nightmarish experience. It's such an intense and unrelenting and invasive soundscape that it literally transforms the body, because your senses, you're being given earplugs, but your body's kind of vibrating with the sound. It's terrifying.
Yeah, we hope that this work, in a way, will come to New York one day. A word that actually in lots of Segal talks came up, by the way. Christopher Dong also was here one day, as was Okada and Ostermeyer from the Schaubühne. But you talk about slow dramaturgy. It's a word that we heard about, that we have to slow down, we're doing too much, that this moment is slowing down what we do. I think, and Bogart very clearly almost screamed in the television, slow the fuck down. She said, slow down. So where does that idea of your slow dramaturgy you wrote about, where does that come in? Is that something that's evolving still, or is it something past?
No, I have to, well, it's something that I'm still working with. I acknowledge also my colleague, an Australian poet and academic, Eddie Patterson, because together, about a decade ago now, we wrote an essay called, on slow dramaturgy. And I think it was the early days of my thinking and Eddie's thinking about this this presence of atmospheres working on the stage, and the breaking into the hermeneutics of the text, and it's also drawing our attention to ecological or eco-critical theory. And so it's a term that I think I'm using this term very much to connect thinking or dramaturgical thinking in theatre and performance to the wider question of ecology and eco-critical practices. So this is something we explored in the New Media Dramaturgy book, where we were working with new materialism and the decentering of the human in the theatrical landscape. We see this in so many works now, Chris Verdonk, but also many great makers creating installation projects that have humans doing some things. It's also, I think, a recognition of the way in which the temporality of theatre has changed. And, you know, if I reflect on the works that we made in the 90s, for example, and in the early 2000s with MYID, Not Yet It's Difficult, they were really intense, fast, physicalized, extreme physical states, kind of relentless, kind of overwhelming. And that was a response, I think, to the decades, of those times.
Tadashi Suzuki inspired.
Yeah, Tadashi Suzuki, and many artists were working in that way. We don't, that work just would not sit well with our age, where we need a much more contemplative, we need a much slower a kind of sensibility in the theatre. And so I think the performance space has become much more like a visual art space, a space for the contemplation of ideas. And it's also something that needs to respond to a much more diversely situated kind of politics, something that is more inclusive, something that is more, in the vein of eco-critical thinkers who talk about the need to sit with the environmental world, and the need to sit with the experience of being with other people, and the need to be less actively intervening and more perhaps responding to. So we see a lot of works now that are asking us to respond to rather than intervene in. And slow dramaturgy, I think, is the way that I've tried to use that term to define that kind of work and that kind of strategy that artists are using in the theatre now. So a slow dramaturgy is one where we sit with rather than overwhelm. A slow dramaturgy is one where we are very attenuated to space and time. And very often we bring in experiences from the quote unquote natural world into the theatre. So what Timothy Morton calls the dark ecology, we bring sounds of water, or we bring videoscapes of trees, or spectacular kind of, not spectacular, anti-spectacular, but beautiful meditations on forces that are in our world that are disappearing. So the work that I most recently worked on as a dramaturg with Alexis Destoop was actually a film work and an installation work that was based on the documentation of the changing life of people in the Arctic Circle with the melting of the ice, and that there's huge impacts on people's lives, but also the haunting of that space from the Cold War still, and from the kind of radioactive sites that are still bubbling away up there. It's a very complex, but ultimately very slow environment, because it's freezing cold, people move slowly, the wind moves, it moves hard, but it's harsh, but it's ships move slowly, the landscape is kind of beautifully slow and vast. But at the same time, it's full of all of these tensions and undercurrents and feelings of change, quite disturbing feelings. So,
do you feel the ecological crisis, in the eco-criticism, is that at the center? Is that what theater should engage with? And the idea of the class struggle, racism, gender identity, and all that? And of course, there's lots about that. But from you, from your engagement, what do you think theater has to engage if it's that area that creates?
To me, the question of the survival of the planet is the preeminent question of our time. The question of the species extinction, the necro-capitalist plot that is project, which is destroying the very sustainability of the planet as we speak, is something that we need to, I think, deal with in our work as much as possible. I'm not suggesting that we only work on that theme. There are many issues and many questions, and theatre should always be about questions. The only thing I would say is that I reject a theatre that is without questions. I don't think that is a worthwhile theatre at all. But a theatre that is dealing with issues of class disparity, racism, is valid. But I think the new media kind of dramaturgy and the new dramaturgy that we're talking about here, the way in which we're talking about this expanded understanding of what performance is a way in which we can very meaningfully engage with these questions. I'm struck by the way in which philosophers and activists and people who write about climate are constantly saying, well, we need the arts. We need the arts to draw attention to this. We need the arts to imagine this, because in some ways it's unimaginable. Yes, we can talk about the destruction of, the fact that so many species have become extinct in the last 2 decades. But really, we to really understand that, I think we need to think of different ways to communicate or show that kind of reality. Yes, we can. There's a great comment by a nuclear scientist who's talking in the aftermath of the nuclear meltdown at Fukushima, and he's on a panel where he's talking to artists and scientists about how to respond to the disaster. And he says, well, I'm paraphrasing, but he says, well, basically, I can tell you what happens in a nuclear meltdown, but actually that doesn't really explain what the crisis is. For that, you need the imagination of artists, because in technical terms, it's quite clear, but the mendacity, the extreme nature of that event is not communicated enough. Mm-hmm. So I do think it's an important, very important aspect. And in some ways, so many of these other questions, of course, dovetail with this, because, we do have a Western economic, or not just Western, but a global economic paradigm that is about the kind of intense exploitation of resources. And those resources include human resources. And within that, you have divisions of labor, and you have class, and you'll have exploitation of different classes, and you have institutional racism and so many other things. So, we can't put everything in we can't, it's, in the 1980s, there was a trend to, you could go to the bookshop and you have these books that were about this thick, and they would be called something like Einstein, Buddha, and Jesus, and they were trying to solve all, there was this sort of unifying theory of everything. I kind of reject that notion. I don't think arts are about specific things and particularities. I'm very suspicious of the unification model.
When you go to New York theater, let's say you go to New York Theater Workshop, LaMama, The Kitchen, PS1, with your background of Asian theater, European, cross-European theater, what do you see? What do you think of the New York scene?
Well, I'm probably going to get a bit into trouble here because, I came to the United States to work in the Graduate Center as a professor of Asian theater and dramaturgy. So I'm not proposing that I have any unique insight. The first thing I noticed is that the actors here are fantastic. I'm in awe at the level of the technical quality of actors. They can do anything, and they can do it really quickly. And they, I remember I was here for I've been here for 8 years now, so it's not new. But quite soon after I arrived here, I went to see a play reading or a workshop of a reading, and the director got up and said, "Oh, well, we've only had a week to work on this. And so people might be on book." There wasn't a single actor on book. And, you do these play readings and these presentations of plays at the Segal, and, typically they get a day to work on them with a director and an actor. And the level of performance that they manage to realize is phenomenal. They're really hard workers and they're really good at it. I find that I've certainly seen some really great theatre, New York-based theatre, but I must say I'm usually drawn to venues that are bringing attention to theatres that have come from elsewhere, coming into New York. The St. Anne's Warehouse, for example, has some really extraordinary programming. I find directors often are risk averse here, with few exceptions. And partly that's to do with the kind of economic structures of theatre here. But then, there are a couple of people that I really think are exceptionally, I think Richard Maxwell is a great visionary. I think he's one of the great artists, playwrights of our time. I saw, I often appreciate the smaller work that doesn't get so much attention, but a lot of it I don't see. I don't go to Broadway that much. Because I'm looking for theatre that is at the centre of some kind of debate for something, rather than just telling us something about who they are. And a lot of New York theatre is about that. And we could shake things up a bit with. There's a sort of way in which the older generation of great success in New York is still, they have these spaces that they don't give up, that they don't let other people use. So there's this way in which we could expect a little bit more attention given to the new generation, for example, than perhaps. They don't really teach performance dramaturgy in the United States, as far as I'm aware. They have really good literary dramaturgs, but if there could be some performance dramaturgy as a viable way of working here, well, I think that would improve things somewhat.
Yeah. Like Daniel Fish, right?
Daniel Fish is, I think his direction of Oklahoma was it was revelatory. I mean, to take a really, kind of embarrassing work that is so overloaded with problematic history and turn it into that was just an extraordinary moment. That's what happens when you have a director who makes an intelligent intervention. Mm-hmm. His production of the Skirball of Don DeLillo's Underworld, or am I remembering the title correctly? Also incredibly brilliant. But where does Daniel work? He works mainly in Europe. His work is not nearly as well supported as it should be. He should be running a major institution here. He should be given all of the support that he needs to make work, because he is, one of the few really outstanding directors, I think, of his generation, currently working out of the United States. You can see I'm a big fan, but
to market, yeah.
It is that level of dramaturgical intelligence that he brings to the work that I find very compelling.
And what perhaps is not so present in many works, where often also, even based on a play, the words are not as significant as they should be. Sometimes there's is something that, with a dramaturgical thinking, a performance dramaturgy would be a better climbing of a mountain, of an artistic work. And one wonders, why is it not part of everybody's toolbox? We're coming closer to the end. And so two questions. One would be, you also are a teacher, so you are kind of as young students, but also artists. But to the people who are listening now, who want to engage in dramaturgy, in that time of Corona, what advice do you have for them? And then at the end, maybe what are you listening to? What are you reading? What's keeping your motor warm? But first, what do you think? How should we use this time? And is it a time of change or not?
I don't know if it's a time of change. I think it will be, things will change, yes. But I don't know that there'll be any sense of us being in control of that. I think that we're in a very reactive moment at the moment, and we have to react with our best abilities. So for example, in working in a university which is dealing with this, we have to do our best to respond to an impossible situation where our students, have to attend class online, and so in a sense we have to bring our best game to that, even though it's never going to be good enough, because the situation itself is overwhelming. I don't know what's going to happen to theatre, and I'm sure it'll return. Personally, maybe that there'll be something new that'll come, and that will be good. But the important thing also is that we don't lose the resources that we need to maybe rebuild is the wrong word, because to move forward, to create the kind of work that we need to create once we're through the coronavirus. So we have to protect things in a certain kind of way, not in a conservative way, but there is a tendency for people to, the dark forces, to use the coronavirus to introduce economic austerity, or there's been a lot of examples of theatre courses being cut from universities because they cost money, or because there's a perception that they're no longer training people for the job market, or we have to do our best to try and protect those kind of those things from this moment of cuts. I mean, the coronavirus is, we also have to think about how do, the situation we're in, and how we got there, which is very much a kind of, it's an eco-critical perspective. It's a perspective about the intensification of globalization. It's in the perspective about the mobility of bodies. It's a perspective around the kind of a kind of strange lack of willingness to do something as simple as wear a mask. We have to think about that, and we have to theorize that, and we have to identify what's wrong with that situation, I think, and make that much more explicit. So there has to be a certain kind of reckoning, I guess. And the reckoning in artistic terms, I think, is going to be a good one. What I think that we rely on our students to continue to do the research that they do, in order to make sense of this moment and to move forward into whatever comes next. Not out of a sense of this kind of inevitable progressive narrative, but in a sense of critical reflection, intelligent thinking, and creative practice being the kind of components that we need to move from where we are now into something else. It won't be a return, but it'll be something, and there may be possibilities within that to reflect more carefully about the mistakes that got us into this situation in the first place.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So to continue that research, whether that's artistic
yeah,
or at a university.
yeah.
So what do you read now? What do you listen to? There's something new,
Well,
something that gave you insights?
I've
Something.
been listening to Idiot Prayer by Nick Cave and Nick Cave alone at Alexandra Palace. It's a performance that he did in the middle of the summer, where Alexandra Palace is a big palace in England somewhere, and he installed a grand piano and in a vast empty space, and he staged this initially as a concert, a pay by an online concert, and now he's just released the recording of it, and he takes several of his really iconic songs from his mid-career period, from after the punk period and after the kind of but into the ballads, the kind of really heart-wrenching ballads, and he reimagines them on this CD or this streaming platform, and they're very pure and they're very simple, and because it's just him and the piano, there's no bad seeds. I watch David Lynch's weather reports on YouTube. I recommend them to everybody. The man is a genius.
Daily ones, yeah.
The daily reports, where he always introduces the weather in LA, which is meaningless to us in New York, but then he has a little sort of reflection on some usually kind of really awful 1960s pop song that he has obsessions for.
Yeah, yeah. And in dialogue with Kenneth Goldsmith,
Yeah,
yeah.
And I've been reading a book by Sabu Kosho, who's a Japanese academic and critic, and it's called Radiation and Revolution, and it's a book that reflects broadly on the history of activism in Japan, the anti-nuclear activism that was revived after the Fukushima disaster. It's probably its eventual closing down, and the rise of the kind of techno-nuclear economic governance that has evolved in Japan, that against all best evidence insists on having nuclear power plants on fault on the fault zones of earthquake-prone landscape in Japan.
Yeah, incredible to even think about it and why.
And he is somebody who's using, he's a Deleuzian. He's using kind of the theory of assemblage to describe what's happening here. So it's a very interesting and important take on trying to understand the countervailing forces. In some ways it's an optimistic book. In some ways it's a very dark book. So
yeah,
I think
maybe one day you make a performance work out of it, of radiation revolution,
yeah.
to perform the knowledge and stuff that we do at the grad center also in programs. Peter Willis, thank you so very much for sharing. And of course, we don't have enough time to go on the work of the Return to Rams and so many other works we should be talking about. But I think it gave us an insight into your thinking, your work. It's also a work in progress, as we show work in progress at the Prelude Festival. This is a work in progress on your book. So really, thank you for sharing. And we all can't wait till it's done. I hope we will have a Segal evening about it. Thanks to HowlRound for hosting us again, Thea and BJ, Andy from the Segal. It's Thanksgiving week next week, and it's good to really also to take that week into account, to appreciate what we have, to acknowledge, but also think about what is missing and how we can be part of a change we want to see. But this reminder from Peter that theater is a place where complexity is exhibited, where you can participate and understand perhaps something that in an agonistic will never will be solved, but with some kind of referee rules, it is a place where people come together in a good way. We discuss it, we understand life, and it's something really unique that theater can offer that perhaps a film and the editorial or a sculpture, will we have a harder time, or has a different place. But this is something that we need, and my guess is it will be so important once we come back, and I will be a new approach, but the ideas that's coming out of that long history of dramaturgy that was so close to the very beginning of theater and the Enlightenment. This is perhaps something we all have to pay attention to, that it has to be dramaturgical thinking behind theater performance work, that it's an engagement with ideas, that it's thinking by doing. And when we see a play, we see actually kind of a thinking on a stage, and it's an argument. It invites us to participate. And so really, thank you, Peter, and thanks for everybody for listening. I know how much now also is out there. We're going to take a break for next week, and then we're going to be back the week later. So thank you for listening, and I hope it was as inspiring and meaningful as it was for me to also hear that, in a spoken form. So such a short time. So Peter, thank you, and
thank you.
And
Thanks very much.
You're writing for the book. Is it behind you, or you already did this morning, or are you going to start?
I did some writing this morning, so I have meetings this afternoon. But yeah.
Still will. Good luck. Okay, Peter. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Bye bye.
Okay.